Yay. Let's see here. Hey, everyone. Okay, let me put this on pause. Why is this doing? Okay. Hey, everyone. We're going to get started. Today is a beautiful, beautiful hormone workshop that is titled Managing Your Hormones in Your 30s and 40s. I'm going to share a presentation with you, so I'm going to be sharing my screen. But before I do that, I just want to say that this lecture is for you guys just as much as it is for me. So at any point in time, you think I'm not explaining something correctly, or you don't understand what I'm saying, and you're really curious about something else, feel free to unmute yourself, interrupt me. I would love, love, love to hear your questions. Okay? So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get this party started. Okay, let me just get out of this so this is not interfering. Way more people are saying that the link is not working. Oh, bumps. Okay. Okay, you guys, we're gonna get started. Okay, so here we go. Today is all about learning how to manage your hormones in your 30s and 40s. And I created this workshop because I feel that women were not properly taught about how to actually take care of the part of themselves that make them a woman. And I don't blame anyone for this because we just simply don't have it in our system. We don't have it in our school education. We don't have it as part of our medical system, that there's going to be someone that's going to stop us and say, hey, your body's amazing. The fact that you're a woman is amazing. And you're this really complex, really cool being. And let me teach you how to take care of yourself. And let me teach you about all the really cool things that happen in your body so that you could have a wonderful life. And because that is missing, most women are navigating their life not to their fullest potential. Because the reality is that our whole hormone playground is really what sets our ability to perceive life, sets how comfortable we are in our skin, and sets our perception of the world around us. So I thought that it would be a real great service to all the women in my orbit to create this presentation so that we could all learn how to properly take care of ourselves and what is so divinely unique in our system. And I'm just going to be so upfront that I was so excited to give this lecture, and now all of a sudden I'm feeling so nervous and I'm starting to fumble and flip-flop in my mind. So I just wanted to say that so that I could get that out there, and then now I could come. Okay. So for those of you who do not know me, my name is Neely and I'm a functional nutritionist. And I've been a functional nutritionist for the last 14 years. And I had the supreme opportunity to help women and men in all sorts of different conditions. I've helped people with anxiety and depression. I've helped people with digestive disorders like Crohn's and colitis. And of course, I've helped both men and women with different types of hormonal imbalances and endocrine dysfunctions. And I'm creating a new phase in my professional life, and I'm creating this new program called the Nourished Women Circle. And this lecture is going to be an example of some of the lectures and courses and classes that are dedicated for women and their health in the Nourished Women's Circle. So if you want to learn more about it, we're going to talk about it at the end of the class, but it's a very powerful initiative for women to help them live their best life as women. In this specific lecture today, we're going to talk about the woman that's between her 30s and 40s. Of course, any female would benefit from hearing this class because the first half of the class is really going to be about education. Because again, like I said before, we're missing an integral part of, of female education in our day-to-day lives. We don't have anyone who's teaching us about our hormones and how they fluctuate throughout the month and how to detect it when they're off and how to nurture ourselves when our hormones are off cycle. And so I feel like in order for us to really understand how we could take ownership of our health and our life, we need to have a really, really firm education in what actually happens in our body. And if we truly, truly, truly understand what is happening in our body, we'll be able to then say, oh, this is most likely off, or oh, I could interpret my blood work now because I attended Neely's lecture, and now I could see what's off, and then I could find that solution. So again, the first part, the first goal of this workshop is to give you that education that I really, really strongly feel that every woman needs. The second one, the second goal of this lecture is to address the very, very specific hormonal issues that happen to every woman in her 30s and 40s. Some issues are more unique to certain women, while other women will experience more of the other issues. But these are the most common issues that every woman in her 30s and 40s will experience to some degree. And once you firmly have that hormone education, like we talked about, the struggles that you will face in your lifetime hormonally will just make so much more sense. But because, again, you will have that education, the solutions that I will give you that are completely concrete, evidence-based, and very actionable will be really so much easier to apply because you'll know exactly why you're doing what you're doing, what it's doing for you, and you'll be able to track your own success because again, you know what's happening. Okay, so we all understand the goal. The goal is to give you that feminine education that is really, really missing, to tell you what to expect in your 30s and 40s, and then to give you those actionable solutions. Now, before we move on, I want to stress why this is so important. Because a really powerful shift happens in a woman's 30s and 40s. The amount of stress that a woman faces when she's in her 30s and 40s is much higher than any other time of her life. She has this stress. She has this almost end stage fertility that she's experiencing, and she has perimenopause right around the corner. And these three components, if not juggled well together, can lead to a really significant hormonal crash. But if we know what to expect, and we know what's happening to our body, and we know how to fortify ourselves, then we could change our hormone dynamic, which will affect our mood and our mindset and our physical health, and will also affect our future years. It will affect how susceptible we are to dementia and Alzheimer's and cardiovascular disease and muscle degeneration. Everything that we do now, right now, will essentially predict not only our life experience now, but our life experience a decade from now, 2 decades from now, 3, 4, ad me'vesrim, God willing. Okay, so that's why I feel like this workshop is so important. Not only are women really missing profound information about their body, and there isn't really an avenue to get there, And what we do now dictates the health for the rest of our female lives. And with that, we could start the presentation. So those are the goals. Now, what are we going to cover today? So we're going to cover 4 major parts. Okay, we have our goals, we have 3 goals, but we're going to overview 4 different components. So the first one is the education. What are the hormones at play here? How do they play with one another? Because most of these hormones happen in a cyclical fashion. There's a domino effect. One will trigger the other, and then there's like a whole, again, domino effect. So what are the different hormones? What are the different players? And how do they have a relationship with one another? That's really, really fundamental for us to understand. And then once we understand that, I'm going to teach you guys how to test your hormones. Which days are you supposed to test certain hormones depending on what proposed issue you're experiencing? And then also how to read them. Because if you've gone to the doctor, which I'm sure you've had, and had blood work taken, which I'm sure you've had, then you'll know that most of the time a doctor doesn't call you back and say, hey, I reviewed your blood work, and this is most likely what's off. Specifically, when most hormone panels are either outdated or because your hormones fluctuate so much and because your doctor's not really tracking what day of your cycle you actually did these tests, then you're going to fall most likely somehow in the reference range. It's very unlikely that you'll fall outside of the reference range in comparison to your entire cycle. And so because of that, you really, really can't rely on your doctor unless you're paying him a ton of money or her a ton of money to really track you. And that's a really, really important part of this. Let me teach you how to interpret your blood work so that you could be your own best advocate and then be able to tell your doctor, listen, this was the time of my cycle. This is really off. There's something going on here. Let's talk about this, which I know shouldn't be the issue, but we're not trying to change the system in this lecture. We're just trying to empower ourselves. Okay. Then we're going to move on to the common hormone struggles. What are the top 3 hormonal struggles that we're going to face, plus a few more? And then, of course, their solutions. Now, the solutions I'm going to give you are going to seem somewhat simple, and yet they're really not. And when we go over them, I think you'll understand why. Okay. All right. Let's begin. Let's meet your best friends. We have 6 hormones that we're going to talk about right now to begin with. We have FSH, which stands for follicular stimulating hormone. We have LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. We have gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is also stands for GnRH. And these are the hormones that are produced in the brain, okay? And then these hormones will trigger the other 3 hormones that we're going to talk about, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, which are all part of this HPO axis. So we have these 3 hormones in the brain that get released, and then they will trigger the release of these other hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, in the ovaries. These are produced in the brain, and these are produced in the ovaries. Now, that's a really, really simplistic picture that I'm painting, and we're going to turn into sexy scientists and totally understand how these are made in a second. But I just kind of want to introduce their functions to you in a nutshell so that you could understand what we're talking about as we go on, okay? So this first hormone that we're talking about is FSH. And FSH has a really unique job. And its job is to stimulate ovulation, to stimulate the fertility of a follicle becoming an egg that will eventually be released. And how it does that is it's a signal that is stimulated in the pituitary gland that travels to the ovaries and communicates to the follicles to start changing and adapting and create estrogen. So FSH literally is responsible for the production of estrogen. Whereas luteinizing hormone, produced in the same part of the brain, has a totally different function, and that is to produce progesterone. So FSH, which is one of the hormones that we make in our brain, is responsible for producing estrogen. Okay. Why does this happen? Because we have this thing called ovulation, which is essentially what drives our race forward. And without this follicular stimulating hormone, the body will not have any stimulus in order to develop the egg and then to start producing estrogen. So this is really where everything starts. And then we have luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone actually causes you to release the egg, and that triggers the production of progesterone. Okay? Now, FSH and LH are produced again in the brain, in the pituitary gland. And they are both triggered by the master hormone, which is less talked about and is equally important. It's called GnRH, and this is produced in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus communicates to the pituitary gland and causes it to either secrete FSH or LH. And I want to show you a picture of this actually happening, okay? So this is a very simplistic picture of the HPO axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, okay? So the hypothalamus, again, is a gland inside of the brain. It is the master gland, and it communicates to another gland right underneath it in the brain, and that's the pituitary gland. And the way, again, that it communicates one part to the other is through this hormone, and that's GnHR. Wait, so sorry, GnRH. I found my own typo. Okay, and then the pituitary gland, from that communication with the hypothalamus, will either stimulate follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. As we said, FSH is going to trigger estrogen and LH is going to trigger progesterone. And of course, at the same time, testosterone is made. This is a really, really simplistic explanation of what stimulates ovulation and our hormones. Are there any questions so far that I could answer? Did something not make sense? Did something go over someone's head? Are we in total agreement with the science so far? And please don't feel embarrassed if you do have a question, because I can guarantee you that even if you think it's a silly question, most likely someone else has it. No? Okay.
Neely.
Yes, I love
Hi,
questions.
Judy
Hi.
Hampman. Hi.
Hi, Judy.
Hi. Okay, so the FSH and LH affects the ovaries, and the ovaries are the ones that create the progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the hypothalamus, again, is your brain. It's in your brain. And it will then stimulate the pituitary gland, which then will stimulate the ovaries. And these are the different hormones at play. So GnRH will stimulate the pituitary gland, which then will stimulate either the production of FSH or LH. And then FSH is going to trigger the follicles to start evolving and maturing. And it does that by stimulating estrogen. Estrogen is produced within the follicles of the ovaries. So again, the pituitary gland will stimulate, the pituitary gland will send FSH to the ovaries. That follicular stimulating hormone will start stimulating the follicles. They start to mature. And as they mature, they produce estrogen. And that is the direct effect of follicular stimulating hormone on estrogen. It stimulates the ovaries, it stimulates the follicles within the ovaries, and that is what produces estrogen. Of course, there are other ways that we produce estrogen that are really, really important that we will get to. But first, we have to understand the normal way that we produce estrogen for the sake of ovulation. And then after the egg gets matured, then luteinizing hormone and progesterone come in. But I'm going to explain that in more detail in a little bit. Okay. Now, there are a few things that are really simple and important that we just conclude based off of this. Okay. So the first conclusion that we should make is that these parts of the body are actually really vitally important for our hormones to be in alignment and balance. So if there's any type of inflammation or stress or injury to any of these parts, like a tumor, like endometriosis, anything, anything that either inflames, again, causes injury, interferes with these three systems, is going to obviously cause a hormonal imbalance. Okay, that should be number one. And then the second obvious thing that we should conclude from this is that all of these work as a domino effect. You have hormone number one, and it will produce hormone number two. And then hormone number two produces hormone number three. If one of those dominoes don't fall in the right way to then trigger the other domino, the rest is not going to happen. And that should be the very, very obvious conclusion from what we see here. And if you've gained just those two things, then you're on track to understand the rest. Okay? So I want to just go back to the previous slide for a second. Let's see, here we go, which is we have FSH, we said produces estrogen. We have luteinizing hormone, which produces progesterone. And we have GnRH, which produces these two. Now, let's just talk about what estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone do, okay? So estrogen is like the most amazing hormone ever. It's what sets us apart as women, because even though men also have estrogen, they do not nearly have the same amount that we do. And we also very much differ in the types of estrogen receptors that we have in our body. So not only do we produce a lot of this hormone, but we also have a really, really unique, dispersion and amount of these estrogen receptors that make our body react differently to stress than men. Our metabolism responds differently than men because of both this unique hormone and the receptors attributed to it. Our bodies are completely, completely different from men. And we have to understand that it is all because of estrogen and the unique receptors that we have that communicate with estrogen. Okay, but what does estrogen, like what function do we receive from it? Obviously, it's really, really important for ovulation and fertility. It's really, really important to create like secondary sexual characteristics like our breasts and our hips and things like that. It's also really important for the unique function of just a female, bone health, brain health, heart health, etc. Our body operates a little bit differently. The way that our cognition works is different than men. We require a lot of estrogen for that. And when our estrogen declines, not like men, not even close to the amount that men have, but when our estrogen declines even slightly, all of those different aspects can be negatively affected. So our hormones go down, our secondary sexual characteristics can change, like our body change, our physical anatomy can change, our bone health will change, our mental health will change, our heart health will change. So estrogen, really, really important for fertility, also really important for just our daily function. Then we have progesterone. Progesterone is just as important for our mental health like estrogen is. And when estrogen declines, progesterone will typically increase, hopefully, in order to compensate for the mental health decline that comes from an estrogen loss. And we'll talk more about that. but it's also really, really important for our uterine lining. And it's what allows for us to maintain pregnancies. And of course, again, like I said before, it has a balancing effect with estrogen. And then the very last hormone, which again, men have more of, which is testosterone, we also really use. And that we use actually to trigger our fertility, but we use it for our sex drive, we use it for muscle mass, we use it for bone health, etc. We need a steady amount of testosterone. Through aging, it can decline, but as long as you do everything that I'm going to tell you to do, this part will be totally in the clear. Okay, so we talked about the HPO axis. We said that really what we're learning from here is that these are the parts of the body in which you stimulate ovulation, that you stimulate fertility, and that if something were to happen to any one of these glands or organ systems, then that's going to negatively affect our hormone balance, and that it's a domino effect. Does that make sense so far?
Haley, can I ask another question? I'm sorry.
I would love. You should know that I love your questions.
Okay, thank you. Estrogen, you had written that that affects bone density, and testosterone affects bone strength.
Also,
I would think that density would determine how strong it is, the bone.
both of them are really, really important. It's just that with the loss of, the reason why both of them are listed is because we have to understand that both of them are really necessary for the female structure. For example, men, if their estrogen declines slightly, it's not going to affect their bone mass, like because they have a lot of testosterone, and that compensates for the fact that they have very low estrogen. Our testosterone can drop maybe really, really significantly throughout our lifetime, which will affect us even in the slightest. But what really, really affects our bone density as women is our estrogen. So both of them are really, really important for our bone strength. So the fact that I used two different words doesn't really make a difference, but the point is that both of them are really necessary, whereas progesterone, not so much. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Now, there's something that's really, really important to understand about this, that we can positively contribute to this HPO axis. We get to stimulate it, or how about I say this? We get to, we have so many resources and tools at our disposal to positively stimulate this HPO axis. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. What affects the HPO axis? And if we understand that, then the resources that I give you will make a lot more sense. Okay. So let's talk about this HPO axis a little bit more in detail. So we talked about GnRH, and we basically said that it's responsible for creating two hormones. And not only is it responsible for creating two hormones, but it also stimulates the same part of the brain in order to make these two hormones. So how is the brain able to differentiate whether it's supposed to make FSH or LH, right? Like you secrete this master hormone, and then the brain is somehow supposed to decide, like, wait, which one am I going to make? So how does it do that? It actually has to do with the rate at which this GnRH is produced and secreted. And so this is what we call pulsatility, okay? So we send out this GnRH in pulses. And if we send out this GnRH really, really quickly and really, really fast, then it's going to stimulate the production of luteinizing hormone. But if we do this GnRH and we secrete it really slowly, then that's going to stimulate our FSH. Okay, so one is either going to directly stimulate, let's say, estrogen in regards to FSH, or luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate, hopefully, progesterone, but it could also stimulate testosterone, and we kind of don't want that. Okay, now if this is kind of confusing, think of it like a secret knock. Okay, like let's say I can't really communicate dynamically with someone, but I need to make sure that I get a message. So one person's behind the door and they want to give me a message, but there are two possibilities of what they could tell me. The fast knock, right? That secret message, that's like, okay, now is my time to produce luteinizing hormone. The slow knock is my secret message to produce follicular stimulating hormone. And that is how the hypothalamus will communicate to the pituitary gland. Now, why is this important? Because the things that we do can confuse how the hypothalamus will trigger or stimulate the pituitary gland, meaning that our stress, our cortisol production, our nutrition, the inflammation in our body, how often we exercise, all of those different components can confuse that secret knock or that pulsatility. So, for example, if I'm like really stressed out and hyped out on coffee, that could change what should be a slow knock into a fast knock. And so therefore, instead of again stimulating FSH production, I could be stimulating luteinizing hormone. And what we're going to learn is if I produce these hormones at the wrong time in my cycle, then the dominoes are not going to fall like they're supposed to. And then this chain reaction that's supposed to happen in order to have a balanced cycle isn't going to happen. So this pulsatility is really, really important for our hormonal health. And I think that this is something that is really, really overlooked when it comes to women's health. Okay, so we want to understand that this is step number one when it comes to our hormonal health, which is the communication of our hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. If something negatively affects that initial kickstart, then the rest is not going to happen. Does that make sense? Yeah. So again, like I said before, we have this GnRH. Depending on the type of rate at which it's secreted, whether it's fast or slow, it's either going to produce estrogen or it's going to produce progesterone. So let's just dig a little deeper, okay? So we said before, the follicles in the ovaries are what produce estrogen. FSH is entirely responsible for stimulating that estrogen production in the follicles of the ovaries, okay? As soon as ovulation occurs, or let me actually say this a little differently. We're going to repeat this over and over again until we understand it. Okay, FSH matures the follicle. That follicle produces estrogen. As soon as that follicle is produced, right? Like if everything goes according to plan, as soon as that follicle is produced, you are going to release that follicle. How is that follicle released? Well, there's going to be something called an LH surge. Luteinizing hormone is going to be secreted by, again, the pituitary gland, and that is going to cause the egg to break off. And then where the egg was before is going to produce progesterone. Okay, we're going to repeat this over again. So if you didn't understand it, we're going to go over this part multiple times. But let's just go back. Depending on how your pituitary, how your hypothalamus is going to communicate to the pituitary gland, you're either going to secrete FSH to then develop the follicles in the ovaries and produce estrogen, which then is going to be followed by luteinizing hormone, which is going to stimulate ovulation and then produce progesterone. Cool so far? Should I repeat anything or does anyone have a question? Okay. Now, like we said before, we get to have influence on how our hypothalamus communicates to the pituitary gland. So the three major ones, the three major elements that will affect that communication is stress, i.e. cortisol production, energy availability like malnutrition, which could either be caloric malnutrition or mineral or vitamin malnutrition, and then body fat. So whether someone is under or overweight, both will affect that communication to the brain. Okay. Now, obviously, sometimes these aspects are really not in our control. Like sometimes life is just really, really stressful, and try as we might, we can't do anything about it. And sometimes our body weight is completely out of our control, and try as we might, we can't change that. So the point here is not to make you feel helpless if one of these things are out of your control, but to give you information as to what could be the potential cause of any type of hormonal imbalance, okay? So we have this pulsatility and we get to influence it, and the three major influences are as such. Okay. So what we would call these negative interferences are neuroendocrine factors. So the first one is cortisol. Cortisol has a feedback loop to the hypothalamus, meaning it will literally stop the hypothalamus in its tracks. Stress will stop the hypothalamus cortisol will stop, or stress will stop the hypothalamus from even communicating to the pituitary gland. But what we're going to learn also is that chronic stress will steal our ability to actually produce estrogen and progesterone. So it attacks us in two different areas. It attacks us in our brain, so it affects that pulsatility that we really, really want, okay? And it will also stop the production of estrogen and progesterone later down the line in the ovaries and the adrenal glands, as we're going to learn. And then there's insulin sensitivity. And insulin sensitivity also is one of those neuroendocrine factors that will actually change the way that our brain will communicate to the ovaries. And we're going to learn more about that in a little bit. So far we learned about this HPO axis. It's actually really simple: hypothalamus, pituitary, ovaries, all for the one goal of ovulation and fertilization, if that's your own personal goal. And then we talked about how there are different things that can interfere with that are sometimes in our control and sometimes not in our control. Okay? I'm going to skip this for now. Now, there are also age-related changes that can occur that, again, are not really in our control. So age-related changes are the following. So puberty is an example of what can happen that will then start triggering this hypothalamus pituitary connection. When we're young and childish, we're not producing our sex hormones like we will be when we're older, because we're not ovulating. We're not planning on, our body is physically not planning on carrying any children. So because of that, this GnRH is really not pulsating. It's not triggering a pituitary gland, and we're not producing estrogen and progesterone. But rising levels of adipose tissue or fat tissue can actually trigger that. So if we're like right now in a population where kids, for example, are much heavier than they used to be, that could be one very obvious explanation for why kids, specifically girls, are getting their periods earlier and earlier, whereas maybe the average age used to be, let's say, for example, 14, and now the average age could be like something like 10. One of the explanations for that is just change in average size. If kids are getting bigger earlier, that change in adipose tissue or body weight can be what triggers their puberty to come earlier. So what do we learn from this? That our weight affects the release of the hormone that then goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, and then again stimulates our either estrogen or progesterone. And then the next age-related change that happens that totally affects our HPO access is perimenopause and menopause. And this really has to do with ovarian reserve and our egg health, and how that will then send a feedback back to the brain to say, ooh, I either need more stimulation or there's really no reason to stimulate me. Okay? So we said that there are certain parts that we can control, and there are certain parts that we can't control. But these are the different elements that we can understand affects the HPO axis. So we said stress, we said body weight, we said, and energy availability. Stress, body weight, and energy availability. When it comes to stress, that could be cortisol, that could be an adrenal type of stress, or it could be insulin, and that's another type of stress. Of course, any other type of inflammatory condition can also affect the HPO axis. Okay. Any questions so far? No? Okay. Now, what we do have control over are certain lifestyle factors. The way that we exercise, and sometimes our sleep. If you're a mom, you know that's sometimes. And so those are things that we could positively use as resources in order to affect our HPO access for our benefit. These are things that we could incorporate again as resources, depending on what the individual situation is, to positively affect our hormones. Okay? All of the reasons, all of these specifically, will have a positive effect on the beginning part of the HPO axis, the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And the reason why, even though this sounds really, really simple, I stress because when sometimes people ask me questions about like what I do and I explain to them and I say help women balance their hormones through food and herbs, they get really, really shocked that they could hear that, oh, there's actually something to be done with nutrition in regards to your hormones. A lot of times people think that it's really, really out of their control. And what we see through a lot of research and evidence is that the way you live and the way that you eat and the herbs that you take and the sleep that you sleep have a profound impact on the communication of your hypothalamus to your pituitary gland, from your pituitary gland to your ovaries, and of course, the overall health of each of these three glands. There is so much more at play here that we could use as resources to help the intricate hormonal system that we have. But if we look at it really, really simplistically, the food and herbs and the sleep that we sleep and all the lifestyle factors that we choose to participate have a profound impact on our hormonal health and our HPO access. And I want to take a moment as an aside to say again why this is so important. It's important because our hormones, again, are what's responsible for the way we perceive our life, how comfortable we are in our body, how we age, and our ability to really seize life and our full potential. And we're also really unique because we're one of the only species that really, really live long after our fertile years are over. And yet, our hormones play such a huge role in our ability to live our best life. So again, what we do now in our 30s and 40s, and even if you're in your 50s watching this, will have such a profound effect on your hormonal life after menopause, which if we're all blessed enough to age and live, we are all going to experience at one point or another. And that's why, again, all the resources that I'm going to give you and the explanation that I'm going to give you is vitally important because it's really what you're going to use as a resource. It's going to dictate how well you live the other half of your life. Okay, let's move on. So I spoke about the HPO axis, and now I kind of want to talk about the HPA axis, because this is another way that we produce hormones. And by understanding this other way, we could understand how these two axes come together in order to successfully ovulate and then release the egg. If it's not fertilized, have a cycle and then start over again. Okay? So we said, let me just go back again. We said we have this HPO axis. This looked super simple, right? 1, 2, 3, brain, pituitary gland, ovaries. I produce these 3 hormones. Okay? We started off simple. It's a little bit more complicated because now I'm going to draw a few more lines, but I guarantee you that what I've drawn here is really just as simple as what I've drawn on the other slide. Okay? So let's go slow and steady. And please, 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 I really love it when people interrupt me. So if you guys don't get something, or I'm just not explaining myself because I'm a human being and I have error, then tell me. Okay? Okay. So this is the HPA axis. And the HPA axis really is the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and instead of the ovaries, the adrenals. And the adrenals are what produces hormones as well. We actually produce hormones in a variety of different places. We produce hormones in the ovaries, like we've discussed, okay? We also produce hormones in the adrenal glands. And even though they don't produce the same amount of hormones as the ovaries do, they can totally interfere in the whole hormonal dynamic and increase our Rg and Rh pulsatility, our likelihood of creating androgens and stimulating PCOS, estrogen dominance, etc. So, and also how our body responds to stress and how that takes away from our hormone production. So understanding this is really, really important. So let's explain. Again, we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, but the pituitary gland is not secreting LH or FSH like it was to communicate to the ovaries. It's actually producing ACTH, and that stimulates the adrenal glands and produces something called pregnenolone. Now, pregnenolone is called the mother hormone because this is the precursor to estrogen, to progesterone, and testosterone. If you don't have pregnenolone, you're not making estrogen, you're not making progesterone, you're not making testosterone. Okay, so this is what we call a precursor hormone. Okay, and it has 2 options. It could either make DHEA in the adrenal glands, which again, if we don't know what the adrenal glands are, let me just explain that first. The adrenal glands are your energy glands. They sit on top of your kidneys. They're 2 triangular shaped glands that sit on top of your kidneys, and they are the brains of your kidneys. They give instruction to how the kidneys should function. And they also are responsible for your fight or flight response, how you handle stress, and your overall excitement and energy. Okay, so pregnenolone, if taken orally, because it's what the adrenal gland produces, and the adrenals again are responsible for your energy, will actually increase your overall energy. Okay, but once you make pregnenolone, you have these 2 options. You're either going to make DHEA, and that DHEA is an androgen, okay? An androgen is a male dominant hormone. This is something that's normally typically high when, let's say, for example, someone's suffering from PCOS, which is an androgen-based hormonal imbalance. And this is something that this is something that the adrenal glands will produce from pregnenolone. And then the body has an option to take this DHEA, which is an androgen, and convert it to estrogen. And that's one way that the adrenal glands can produce estrogen by, again, making pregnenolone, making DHEA, and then making estrogen. Okay? Wonderful. Now, why is this so important? Like, you might be like, why is she nitpicking on all of this? Why do I need to know this? Well, let me explain you. For the exact reason like PCOS, if let's say you're doing a blood test, right? And in your blood test, you see, oh, I have really high DHEA. Oh, that means that one, I'm probably overstimulating my adrenal glands, maybe from stress. And two, I'm not converting it to estrogen. And that's where my imbalance is. That's the place and the domino effect, the line of dominoes, that's the issue. And if I understand that that's the issue, that's the part that I'm supposed to treat. So all the solutions that I'm going to put all my energy into discovering and implementing is going to be around that. If no one's going to explain it to you, if your doctor tests you for your DHEA, but like what happens in most labs is that the reference range for DHEA is the same for men and women, which is complete like stupidity. Then your doctor is not going to call you and say, oh, by the way, you are outside of the reference range. Because a woman's DHEA is really not supposed to be above 4. And if it is above 4, then she has some type of androgen dominance. But her doctor's not going to call her and say, hey, you're outside of the reference range because the reference range is adjusted for men. And men could have a DHEA of 11 and be fine. So this is why I'm going over this pathway so that you can understand how do I produce hormones and understand the whole picture so that when we talk about testing, you'll be your own advocate and know exactly how to support yourself. Does that make sense? So we make pregnenolone, we take that and we make DHEA, and then we use that to make estrogen. And that's one way our adrenal glands make estrogen. We could also take this DHEA and make testosterone. Testosterone is made in the ovaries, like we discussed, it's made in the adrenal glands, and it's also made in other tissues. But this DHEA can also make testosterone, and this testosterone can then later be either converted back into estrogen or into something called DHT, which is like a hormonal dead end, which is high for people with PCOS, and normally is what causes facial hair on the face and balding for women on their scalp. DHT is really, really hard to test for. So most likely we just assume that people have elevated DHT just by their symptoms. This is something that's adequately tested for in a saliva test, not in a blood test. Whereas testosterone, you could accurately test for in a blood test. Okay. Now this is one side of the pregnenolone equation. We could also use pregnenolone to make progesterone. And progesterone, like we said, is made in the ovaries, and that's what we produce after ovulation. And it's also produced in the adrenal glands. Okay. Sometimes women could have really, really high progesterone, like too high progesterone. And most likely that's not happening because of the ovaries. Most likely that's happening because of the adrenal glands are over exacerbated and producing too much progesterone, which could make a woman just as crazy as if she has too little. Okay. Now that progesterone could either stay there, or it could make cortisol in the case of someone who is in a severe stress state and is having a severe stress response. Or she could use that progesterone to then make testosterone, which could then either stay there, go to DHT, or do what we would love it to do, which is make estrogen. Okay. Any questions on this? Should I repeat it one more time? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? I would really love the feedback and answer any questions now while you have me. Because if we don't understand this, then it's not, what we go onwards is not going to be understandable. I see there are questions
Hi,
in the chat.
Neely.
Hi.
Um, okay, I don't know if I missed something, but when you started the slide, you were like, okay, so the hypothalamus releases the ACTH, but did we talk about that before this slide? Like, where
No,
did
we
that
did
come?
not. We
Okay,
did not. This is the first time we're talking about ACTH.
so is this
So
separate? Okay,
just like before when we talked about how FSH and LH are produced in the pituitary gland to then communicate to the ovaries. So what we were saying is uniquely different about the HPA axis is that we're not using FSH or LH like we did before, but we're instead using ACTH. And that is how we're then creating how we're participating in a totally different axis in order to produce a hormone response. So my brain could either stimulate my hypothalamus could either stimulate my pituitary, and my pituitary gland is going to participate in ovulation by secreting FSH and LH, which then is going to stimulate my estrogen and progesterone. Or a totally different, like backdoor response could be that my pituitary instead is going to produce ACTH, which instead of, again, going down the route of affecting the ovaries, is going to stimulate the adrenal glands. And that is what makes this unique to the HPA axis. The hormone that the pituitary gland is going to choose to use at that time is going to then trigger a hormonal response. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot more sense. But
Okay, I appreciate that you
when
asked.
when when does this axis happen? Like what causes this to happen? Like what's
Ah,
the
that is such a great question. Fantastic. Okay, so when it comes to the production of FSH and LH, that is completely based off of the maturation of the egg. Okay, so like for example, and we're going to actually see this in a graph, but FSH is going to be like the first hormone that's going to kick your cycle into gear as soon as like you bleed, right? And let's say the first day of your cycle, the first day of your period is like day 1 or day 0, okay? So the first hormone that's going to kick into gear is FSH, and that's going to be what stimulates your estrogen. Let me just make sure. My screen just changed colors and I'm not sure why. Okay. So that's going to be what kicks everything into gear. And based off of that, then that's going to affect the production of estrogen and the production of luteinizing hormone, and then eventually the production of, is my screen changing colors for anyone else or is it just me? Oh, I understand what's happening here, you guys. Just 1 second. Just 1 second. It's going on night mode and it's getting really red and I just need to change it. Sorry, guys. 1 moment. It's like
It's
a little
not
funny.
It's not changing our view though.
Okay. It's just making it look really strange for me. So just 1 moment. Okay. All right. I'm sorry. So what I was saying before was that in regards to the production of estrogen and progesterone before, that really had to do with the whole domino effect of FSH slowly increasing, and then the maturation of the egg to eventual ovulation, and then the release. That is a whole domino effect. Whereas here, this is happening more consistently throughout time. It does come in waves depending on the amount of stress that a person is under, or the lack of stress, the amount of activity. This is a more consistent process. It's also a more minor process. Like I am not creating as much estrogen or as much progesterone or as much testosterone in this fashion. But the reason why this is so important for us to understand is because when it allows for us to understand the different interplay between the different hormones. Like for example, how you see this progesterone, for example, even though the ovaries produce progesterone and the adrenal glands produce progesterone, if you fundamentally understand that progesterone could be used to produce cortisol, then when we talk more about this, you'll understand what it means to have a progesterone steal or a pregnenolone steal, which is how stress can affect our hormone production. If we're really, really stressed out because life is undoubtedly stressful and we're just having a really hard time managing it, then instead of progesterone being used to go to the uterine lining, protect our pregnancy, etc., if instead that hormone is then being used to produce cortisol production, that's a progesterone steal. And we're increasing our cortisol production because we're stressed, and that's in direct proportion to our progesterone deficiency. So this HPA axis is showing us two things. It's showing us how the HPA axis produces hormones and also the interplay between different hormones. How testosterone could be used to make estrogen, whether it's in the ovaries or in different tissues, like the adrenal glands. Or how progesterone, even though it could be made in the adrenal glands and in the ovaries, can be stolen away and be made into cortisol. So the HPA axis is happening without the same type of stimulus that the HPO axis is happening in regards to the ovulation and the maturity of the eggs, but it's also showing you the dynamic interplay between those hormones. Does that make sense?
Okay, it makes more sense. I
What
have a
doesn't make
question.
sense?
I think it's just a lot. Like I would replay it if I could.
I would be
Um,
happy to replay it. I'd be happy to go over it again. Would that be
okay.
helpful?
Yes. And I had another question because I did hear
Please.
you say that progesterone could be stolen instead of it affecting the cycle positively or affecting the pregnancy positively. It can be
Mhm.
stolen to make adrenals or like by the adrenals.
And
So,
cortisol.
right, for cortisol. So could that I have found a link in myself between like miscarriages and stress.
Yeah, 100%.
So is that the reason why?
That's one
Or
of the
could
major reasons why.
okay.
Stress negatively affects the communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which then is what will trigger the rest of the body, as the rest of the hormonal cycle. But again, progesterone can be taken and turned into cortisol. And this is why there's a name for it, which is called either the pregnenolone steal or the progesterone steal. And basically, you're taking these feminine hormones and you're converting them into cortisol because your body feels threatened. And the way that it protects itself from that threat, regardless of whether it's real or not, imaginary or really right in front of you, is by producing cortisol. You produce cortisol in order to fight, flight, or freeze. That's a protection mechanism. That is going to that's going to be prioritized more than your cycle, more than your baby, if you are feeling threatened. And that is called a progesterone steal or a pregnenolone steal. And that could definitely be why once someone has low progesterone or has a difficult time conceiving, because you need to have enough progesterone in order to just have a thick uterine lining to have implantation. It could be one of the reasons why someone could have low progesterone. There are multiple reasons. But the reason why we could even talk about it is because now we kind of understand the interplay, the domino effect that happens with all these other hormones. There are the hormones that we produce that are in direct proportion to our ovulation. There are the hormones that we produce as a consistent result of our adrenal glands functioning. And then there are the hormones that we produce when we are stressed, when we're inflamed, when life is challenging. And if we could understand how it works when it's normal, then it will be easier for us to understand how it doesn't work when it's not normal. Does that make sense? Should I go? I'm going to go over this one more time to explain it, okay? And I'm going to stop share for a second, even though the picture is really important. I'm going to stop share. And then we'll go back to the picture. So let's say it like this. So far, we've talked about two different accesses. We have the HPO axis and we have the HPA axis. The HPO axis is the first thing that we talk about because that's really the hormonal layout that we use in order to stimulate our fertility and our ovulation. And we outlined it really simplistically to say, wait a minute. What happens is the hypothalamus communicates to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland will communicate to the ovaries. And it will communicate differently depending on where we're at in our ovulation process, whether we're maturing the follicle, whether we're about to release the egg, whether the egg is released and now we're building up the uterine lining. We're going to produce our hormones differently. And it's very, very cyclical, like we saw. And then we introduced the HPA axis. And the HPA axis is simply just showing us that we actually produce these same hormones in a totally different place with a totally different stimulus. And it starts in the adrenal glands from this mother hormone called pregnenolone, and it will go in two different routes. It will either go in the route where it produces progesterone and testosterone, or it will go into the route where it produces DHEA and estrogen. And people will vary in their tendencies of how much DHEA they'll produce or how much progesterone they'll produce. But eventually, those are supposed to, if everything is working properly, go to, again, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And what we want to understand, besides just understanding that there's a different way of making these hormones, is the interplay between the two. The fact that when I make DHEA, it's with the physical intention of taking that DHEA and making estrogen. When I make progesterone, it's with the intention of either making progesterone or using it to make testosterone or using it to make estrogen. Those are my intentions. But if I understand the other interplays, sorry, let me say this differently. And if I understand those interplays, it'll be easier for me to understand when something's going wrong. Like, for example, with PCOS, when someone has elevated DHEA and it's really not converting into progesterone. Sorry, excuse me, DHEA, and it's not converting into estrogen. And the fact that all that DHEA is accumulating is a sign that I have androgen dominance, and that is interfering in my ovaries completing ovulation. Does that make sense? Christina, I'm looking at you because I see your screen. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me,
Okay, perfect. Fantastic.
you
Okay, so
always,
now I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Okay. Now I want to join the two images together. And this is if we were to combine the HPO axis in green and the HPA axis, as we saw before. The pituitary gland will stimulate FSH and will create estrogen in the ovaries. And the pituitary gland will produce luteinizing hormone, which will produce both progesterone and testosterone. And these are the different ways in which we make hormones. We could also make these hormones in our fat tissue. Okay, so we make it in our ovaries. We make it in our adrenal glands. We could also make it in our fat tissue. And this will definitely come into play when we have something like estrogen dominance, because sometimes we could overly produce estrogen because we have an excess amount of fat tissue. Sometimes that is in our control and sometimes it's not in our control. Like in the case of lipedema, where you have a genetic condition where you're just obese. There's nothing you could do about it. This is the condition. Doesn't matter how healthy you eat, you're going to be obese. So if you are aware of that and you're having a hormonal struggle, know that this is most likely the cause of it, right? When we understand how our hormones are produced, where they're produced, and we understand the interplay, it'll be so much easier for us to be our best advocates. Okay. Before we talk about this really important picture, okay, I want to break this ovulation cycle down a little bit more. We want to recognize that our estrogen, our progesterone, our testosterone is really all being made for the sole purpose of producing life. even if we don't decide to produce life. But that is the motivation, that is the drive for these changes in hormones. And so let's just go over one more time how we produce these hormones and what's the stimulus. And if you're like, oh my gosh, Neely, like, I can't believe you're going over this again. Trust me, the more I go over this, the more I understand it more. So everyone's benefiting from going over this one more time, okay? We have different phases when it comes to our cycle. We could break it down in a few different ways, but first we're going to call this the follicular phase, which is really the first phase. And like we said before, the follicular phase, or day one of our cycle, really gets driven by FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. And like we said before, FSH is stimulated by the hypothalamus with the GnRH, okay? And what this essentially does is it stimulates the follicles. And as the follicles grow and mature, you produce estrogen. Now, something that's really interesting to know is that we don't just produce one egg. We actually stimulate multiple follicles at one time. And one of those will mature in the best way, and one of those follicles will be released. But it's important to know, just because it's important to understand our body, that we are actually stimulating multiple eggs, or multiple potential eggs, let's say, at a time. Let's say at least 10 typically. Okay, so we're producing these follicles, we're maturing them with the stimulus of FSH. And one of them is just going to be super stellar outstanding. And that increase in estrogen, because now the eggs are really mature, and you have this increase of estrogen, that's going to send a feedback loop back to the brain, back to the hypothalamus. And it's going to say, hey, hypothalamus, I am ready. I am a nice mature egg, like a peacock that's just like spread out its wings. And it's saying, look at how ready I am, even though it's the male peacock, but we'll just pretend. Okay. So I am ready. And then it's going to say, let me knock fast, release luteinizing hormone. And what that luteinizing hormone is going to do is it's going to signal the ovulation. And this is called an LH surge, luteinizing hormone surge. It is the boom, let's release the egg. She is this beautiful peacock ready to go. Let's release her. I'm going to send out the biggest, most beautiful peacock out there. And the other follicles that didn't mature will eventually die down. Now, that's the first phase. That's the follicular phase. And it's called the follicular phase because we're maturing the follicle, okay? And it's with the stimulation of FSH, producing estrogen, which then causes an LH surge. Okay. And then we have ovulation. And again, ovulation, like we said, is that dominant follicle, that beautiful, spectacular follicle that is big and mature and is released. And that's the egg that is now ready to be fertilized. Okay? Now, then we start the luteal phase, which is the second phase of the cycle. And the luteal phase is like this. The luteal phase is the part of the follicle that is left over, like the car has left, but you have the garage stays where it is. So let's just say that garage, which is called the corpus luteum, excuse me, is what's going to start producing progesterone. It's saying, aha, the egg is out. It has been released. It wants to be fertilized. And if it gets fertilized, it will want to stick to the uterus, to implant, to become eventually a child. And so what it will do is it will stimulate the production of progesterone, which is what stimulates the uterine lining to be really nice and thick, and what makes, again, that uterus ready for implantation from that fertilized egg that may or may not become fertilized, okay? And what happens is if fertilization doesn't occur, right, then the hormone levels will drop, and then menstruation will happen, and then the cycle will repeat itself. Each step of this is regulated by the HPO axis, timed, depending on FSH, how high estrogen is, luteinizing hormone, progesterone. And I want to show this to you in a picture. And this is the picture. A beautiful picture that shows the waves, the fluctuations of the hormonal cycle as it's supposed to be. Okay? Now, this is estrogen as it rises and falls. This is progesterone as it rises and falls. Really, what this is showing us is exactly what we discussed. It's showing us that day one of our cycle, our hormones are at its lowest because if our hormones are at their lowest, it means there was no fertilization. The period is going to be initiated. Okay, 5 days of flow, let's say as an example. And the first thing that's going to happen is FSH is going to start to rise, this little dotted blue line. As soon as it starts to rise, oh, estrogen starts to go up. Estrogen gets up high enough, an LH surge is going to happen. It's just a surge, it just goes up just to stimulate ovulation. And then that release of luteinizing hormone is what causes that progesterone to go up. Now, why is this so important? Is because if we know what is expected to happen, then we could test for it on specific days that things are supposed to happen, right? We want to look at this so that we could have a marker to say what is normal. When I measure my hormones, I want to compare it to what is normal. And if something is not normal, I could then compare it to what it's supposed to be like to see what's off or what's really, really great. Okay? So essentially, if I was to use this picture as a means of understanding of testing my hormones, then I would say there are 3 really fantastic days to measure if things are in proper alignment. The first is the 2nd or 3rd day of my cycle. The second test is day number 10. And the third test is day number 21. Okay? This is the day of when my cycle has started, my period has started around this time. This is the day where estrogen is supposed to really be at its highest, which then will hopefully create an LH surge. And this is the day 21 is the day when really my progesterone is supposed to be at its highest. If I measure these 3 times and something is off, it's not comparably accurate, then I'm like, oh, there's something to pay attention to. There are a few things that we want to understand about this. That depending on the day at which I measure, I'm going to have different results, right? My estrogen is going to be different on this day versus this day. So I anticipate different results. And the next thing that we're going to say, which I hope you guys make sense because I don't understand why most doctors don't understand this, is I can't draw any type of conclusion with just one test. I'll give you a perfect example. Let's say I was a typical doctor and I was going to run a blood test on your hormones and I did it on day 2 or 3. Well, day 2 or 3, we expect for all of your hormones to be at their lowest. And if let's say you have a blood test and look at that, all of their hormones at their lowest, that doesn't reflect whether your estrogen is getting high enough or your progesterone is getting high enough. So really, you should really be doing, if you're measuring your hormones to see how in alignment you are, you should be measuring at least 2 different days of your cycle, if not all 3. Now, most doctors will say, hey, let's do this test, which can sometimes be very informative. But really, the tests that you want to test for are day 10 and day 21. So if you go to your doctor and they're like, okay, do this test on day 2, 3, You're going to be like, I'm going to do it on day 21. This is the preferred date. Because if this is adequate, most likely the things happening before took place because it's at the end of the domino effect. If this is not accurate, then move on to day 10. And if day 10 is not accurate, move on to day 2 or 3. Does that make sense so far? Now, what test should you do? You shouldn't just do the tests that I showed you just now, which is estradiol, progesterone, FSH, or LH. You should also do DHEA. You should measure your testosterone, and you should measure prolactin. And these are the different hormonal tests that, again, you should do on either day 2 or 3, day 10 or 21. But you're going to work backwards. You're going to first do day 21. And if something about that is really strange, you're going to do day 10. And if something about that is really strange, you're going to do day 2 or 3. And then this should just be mentioned that these are really good blood tests to do because as we're going to learn, sometimes it's not the hormones that are causing a hormonal imbalance, excuse me, sometimes it's one of these. And so these tests should be done once a year minimum. You don't have to retest them on all of these different days. These hormones you test for on these different days, this is just regular blood work that you should do once a year to just make sure that these different components are not affecting your hormones. Now that we kind of understand how, what stimulates our hormones and why, and all the different factors and the interplay to some degree, right? As much as we could understand in the short time that we have together. Now let's understand the different problems that could happen. What are the normal problems that I typically find in my clients between their 30s and 40s? The first problem is typically low progesterone. Low progesterone is one of the most common problems in women in their 30s and 40s. And it goes unchecked because, like I said before, if we go back to this picture, most doctors will test your hormones here. But if you had your period, your hormones are going to be at their lowest typically. So if your progesterone is shown to be low here, then it's kind of like normal. But if you test on day 21, and let's say instead of your progesterone being here, it's down here, then you know that you're suffering from low progesterone. But again, it goes very much unchecked because most doctors are not testing you here. And this would be the very first test that you should really, really do because it's the most common problem in women in their 30s and 40s. It's something that gets triggered by perimenopause. Perimenopause is what happens as we shift into not having a cycle anymore, which can vary from anywhere from the age of 45 to, let's say, 55, okay? But typically the symptoms or the hormonal changes of menopause can start anywhere from 7 to 10 years before. And the very, very, very first symptom or hormonal dysregulation that it's going to cause is low progesterone. But it's not only from perimenopause, and we'll talk more about what perimenopause is. But there are a few different reasons why a woman could have low progesterone. So first we want to know, are you experiencing low progesterone? And then if you are, let's just understand all the different ways that a woman could, why she would experience low progesterone. One would be PCOS. PCOS has a classic sign, okay? High luteinizing hormone, high androgens, low progesterone. That's very classic PCOS. Another reason for low progesterone could be that the hypothalamus is really not being stimulated either by stress, by severe exercise. That's called hypothalamic amenorrhea. Okay, that's when you're not really getting your cycle because progesterone is really not being stimulated. The uterine lining is not getting thick enough. And then you're like, that is why, let's say, for example, athletes would not get their cycle. Perimenopause we described. Stress in that pregnenolone steal. I'm going to go back to that picture just so that we understand what I'm saying. We make progesterone in our luteal phase, but if we're overly stressed, that will turn into cortisol, and that could be the reason why our progesterone is really low. Okay. Over exercise causes that hypothalamic amenorrhea. Luteal phase deficiency. This happens naturally to people and as a result of perimenopause. What this LPD means is that the corpus luteum is simply just not producing enough progesterone. That the garage where the car departed and now is like the signal is to produce progesterone. It could simply just have a genetic deficiency or a stress response or inflammatory deficiency, like a inflammatory effect where it's just not producing enough progesterone. But the source of the issue is coming from the corpus luteum. It's coming from the ovary. So doing some of the things that we're going to be talking about, like the specific foods that I'm going to tell you to eat and decreasing inflammation, will help with that LPD. However, sometimes it is genetic. Thyroid dysfunction is a really big contributor for a lot of different hormonal imbalances, which is why when I told you to do this blood test, we're testing for at least 4 different markers of a thyroid imbalance. If your hormones are off, but your thyroid is also off, you have to treat the thyroid first, because most likely that's why your hormones are off. So you could have low progesterone because of a thyroid imbalance. Either you're not having proper conversion of T4 to T3, or you have some type of inflammatory thyroid condition, like that's where the inflammation in your body is targeting. Or it could be even a virus that's affecting the thyroid, or the liver is so overwhelmed that the thyroid can't clean itself out. That could be a reason why you could have low progesterone, and then estrogen dominance can be a reason, and chronic inflammation. So if you on day 21 test and your progesterone is low, you're going to go through this list and say which one of these could be the case. Another very common problem is estrogen dominance. Estrogen dominance, like I said, I'm going to say this differently. Estrogen dominance is the second most common issue. This means that you have too much estrogen at multiple parts of your cycle. You could have either too much estrogen here, your estrogen climbs too high, or your estrogen is too high here. And the reason why that matters is because estrogen and progesterone are really supposed to balance for one another. And if they are too not in alignment, then it could either generate some type of really, really horrible PMDD, which is a type of psychiatric disorder that comes from these hormones being too high and then too low, or it could stop the maturation of the egg like we want it to. Okay. So estrogen dominance is the second symptom of perimenopause. Typically, perimenopause will cause low progesterone, and after that progesterone gets too low, it's categorically too low compared to the estrogen. The balance is off, and our estrogen is too high. Estrogen dominance can sometimes happen in cases of PCOS, but not always. Again, when progesterone is low, that could stimulate estrogen dominance, so LPD could be a cause. Again, thyroid dysfunction could be an issue. But the major issues when it comes to estrogen dominance, or the major reasons for estrogen dominance, if it's not perimenopause or if it's not PCOS, is going to be the latter. Poor liver detoxification, gut dysbiosis, and the absorption of BPAs or estrogen disruptor or endocrine disruptors, like things that we find in plastics and perfumes and creams. That can negatively affect people, and that's very much genetic. So there are some people that are chemical super absorbers, and you could actually do genetic testing for this to see if you're just in that category of person that these external contaminants are really, really intense endocrine disruptors for you. But when it comes to estrogen dominance, I want not to look at the zebras, the rare cases, but to look at the most common reasons why someone could have estrogen dominance. It's either the second stage of their perimenopause, or it could be a side effect of PCOS, or most likely it's poor liver detoxification. What does that mean? The liver is responsible for breaking down the estrogens that we don't need. We produce it, it has a lifespan, and then we're supposed to destroy it. And the liver is responsible for that destruction. And sometimes, if the liver is too overwhelmed, it won't properly break down that hormone, or it will break it down in a way that's really not advantageous for the body and create estrogen metabolites that can increase your risk for breast cancer and other types of estrogen-based cancers. So liver detoxification is a really, really important avenue to assess when you have estrogen dominance, but it's really, really hard to test for in a blood test. This is where you could only really test if you have estrogen dominance from a liver issue in a saliva test. There are some chronic symptoms that come from poor liver detoxification. What I would do that's really, really easy to look at is to stick your tongue out in the mirror and to see if you have something called liver ridges. Liver ridges are when you have teeth indentations on the sides of your tongue. That's a clear sign that the liver is really, really overwhelmed and is most likely not breaking down your hormones properly. And another sign that the liver is off, if your tongue is too swollen or thick. That's another sign that your liver detoxification could be too slow. It wouldn't be the only thing that I would base it off of, but sometimes we can't afford these really, really expensive saliva tests or urine tests. And so that's something that you could use if, again, you have estrogen dominance. Check your tongue to make sure it's not coming from liver dysfunction. And then the last most common reason for estrogen dominance could be gut dysbiosis. And the reason why is because if your digestive tract is not functioning properly, most likely you're reabsorbing the estrogens your liver has put into your digestive tract to clear out. So we break down estrogen, we take it out through the liver. The liver is a digestive organ. It's supposed to clear out those estrogens through the digestive tract, and we could reabsorb those estrogens. And that could be another reason why we have estrogen dominance. Now, if gut dysbiosis is the reason why you're having a hormonal imbalance, then obviously it's not going to go away until you treat your digestive tract. So treating the digestive tract in this case would be the first best step instead of treating the hormonal imbalance. The hormonal imbalance is a secondary issue to the primary issue, which is gut dysbiosis. As soon as you clean out your digestive tract and the digestive environment gets reestablished and motility gets reestablished, then estrogen will not be reabsorbed. You'll be able to then either start treating it or just by the digestive tract being cleared, it in and of itself will establish itself and rearrange itself. Okay, so these are the two most common problems with hormonal problems with women in their 30s and 40s. But then it could also be low estrogen. And low estrogen is the third step in perimenopause. So it started off as low progesterone. Remember, we said perimenopause, the effects of it could happen 10 years before menopause actually hits. So if let's say it happens from the age of 45 to 55, then women could essentially be experiencing perimenopausal symptoms at the age of 35. So low progesterone is going to be that first symptom. Estrogen dominance is the second symptom. And then low estrogen is that third symptom. And it comes because of declining ovarian reserve. The ovaries are what produce estrogen, but it's not just the ovary, it's the follicle. The follicle produces estrogen. But if you have low ovarian reserve, then you don't have enough follicles to produce enough estrogen. And so therefore, your total estrogen production is really, really low. Remember, we said estrogen is what stimulated the hypothalamus to then produce luteinizing hormone, which is then what produces progesterone. So if estrogen starts to go down, then the result of that is progesterone is going to start going down as well. So low estrogen will then by default stimulate low progesterone, and then it just gets worse. But if it's not because of declining egg reserve, then it could be from a variety of other reasons. It could be hypothalamic dysfunction, meaning you're not producing enough stimulus either from the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland to the ovaries. That could totally happen. It could happen because of adrenal fatigue or a thyroid imbalance or from chronic stress, right? And another common reason why this could happen, which doesn't really get looked into, which is why I told you to measure your prolactin, which is that elevated prolactin either by incorrect stimulation of the pituitary gland because of stress or because of post-birth or because of a tumor, that will suppress estrogen. And then again, the suppression of estrogen will stop ovulation and stop the production of progesterone. Hypothyroid, the thyroid directly stimulates GnRH. If the thyroid is off, the hypothalamus will not correctly stimulate the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will not stimulate the ovaries. Hypothyroid is a very, very common problem amongst women in their 30s and 40s. Why? The 30s and 40s are the most stressful years of a woman's life. She has more responsibilities. She has so much on her plate. She has less sleep than ever before. And life is full. And sometimes so full that she can't take care of herself. Like the theme of the 30s and 40s is like, how do I manage myself at the same time that I'm managing everything else? And because of that, there's more inflammation, which is a killer for the thyroid. There's more inflammation, which is the killer for our liver, which then makes the thyroid more congested and more inflamed. And sometimes the dysfunction of the buildup of all of that stress can then destroy the thyroid as well. So those are all the different reasons why a woman in her 30s and 40s can develop hypothyroid. It could also be hyperthyroid, but hypothyroid is a lot more common, which is why we're talking about it. Adrenal fatigue. Adrenal fatigue could be stimulated by obviously all the stress that women and people just experience because life could be really messy and crazy. It could come from chronic inflammation. It could come from allergies. It could come from vitamin and mineral deficiencies, like chronic B vitamin deficiencies can increase the risk of adrenal dysfunction. And then that, again, will affect the HPO axis. And then, of course, perimenopause. Perimenopause is one of the most common problems that we just simply don't address. It could happen 10 years before menopause even hits. So if someone's going to experience menopause at 45, they could be very well experiencing symptoms at 35. What is menopause? Let's just talk about it, okay? It's really, really important that we understand. And I also really understand that we're over time. We're gonna get to solutions really, really quickly. Here's the deal with perimenopause. Our fertility is dictated by our egg reserve. We are born with the most amount of eggs, or even before we're born, when we're in utero, our eggs are already being produced. So even before we're born, we have the most amount of eggs. Let's say we have 7 million follicle numbers, okay? We have 7 million follicles that eventually, at some point, will produce an egg and be used for ovulation. But like I said before, we produce or mature more than one follicle for every cycle. And also, as we age, our eggs just start to die off. So as you see, we already have a decline in the amount of eggs that we have, even before puberty, before we even had ovulation. And as we get older and older, and the more we ovulate, and the older that we get, the egg count starts to go down. And because this egg count starts to go down, our ability to produce hormones like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone also starts to go down. It has to do with ovarian health, like the health of the actual ovaries, whether they're inflamed or not. It has to do with the count of eggs, how many eggs we have, and the quality of the eggs. inflammation and genetics are one of the biggest indicators of the quality of our eggs. The more inflamed our body is, the lower quality our eggs are going to be. So we could have a high egg count, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality is there. And so either the egg count is going to start going lower, or the quality is going to start going lower, and that is going to have an overall effect on our ability to produce estrogen, our ability to produce progesterone, our ability to produce the other hormones, because they go back into a feedback loop into the HPO axis. Menopause is going to happen if we are all blessed to get old enough to experience it. Our egg supply is going to drop down. There's no way around it. We can't prevent it. But what we can prevent, which totally affects this HPO axis and this process, is our intervention. How do we prevent the inflammation that affects our ovaries, which will then, if we prevent that as much as possible, make this landing so much smoother rather than a crash and a burn? And if I know that it's happening, can I buffer it so that, again, I land gracefully rather than crash and burn? Does that make sense? So now I would like to talk about solutions, but if there are any questions about what we've talked about so far, I would really love to answer it. Or maybe I should just go into solutions because we're so over time. Okay, you guys could decide. Interrupt me if you have a question. Okay, so now the solutions that I'm giving you are like this. I know that I'm speaking to a crowd of people that have their own hormonal profiles and their own unique hormonal situations. And I want to be able to give everyone in this group solutions. Okay. Normally, if someone was to work one-on-one with me or in one of my organized groups, then I would be able to give you guys individual suggestions and professional advice to say, this is what you should do to therapeutically change your hormonal profile. But because that's not the situation, what I could tell you now, the simple solutions that I'm going to give you now are, if you do this, will help literally every person listening. And then I'm also going to list out the different things that you could do in different situations. So first, we're going to say you're a hormonal woman, you have hormones, you have to take care of them. This is what you should do. And then I'm going to go through the specific situation so that you could look back afterwards and say, I have this as a resource. This is what I should focus on. I should also get individual attention, but this is going to give me some type of empowerment to know how I should better myself. Okay. So the very first solution is called seed cycling. Seed cycling is one of those interventions that is so stupidly simple and so effective for how simple it is. I mean, it's like pure magic. It's silly. If you haven't heard about seed cycling, the idea is that you eat different seeds depending on the phase that you are in your cycle, whether you're in the follicular phase or in the luteal phase. And it has to do with the minerals and the fats found in these seeds. And by eating these specific seeds during these specific times, you're either going to improve your ability to produce estrogen in the luteal phase, in the follicular phase, or your ability to produce progesterone in the luteal phase. All right. So day 1 to day 14, you eat raw and ground flaxseed and pumpkin seeds. You could decide to eat one over the other or eat both of them. Both are really important. And the more seeds you eat, the more impact you'll have. So again, days 1 to 14, regardless of how screwed up your cycle is or how amazing your cycle is, that's what you're going to eat. And then days 15 to day 28 in the luteal phase, you're going to eat 1 to 2 tablespoons of sunflower seeds, 1 to 2 tablespoons of raw ground sesame seeds. Spina does not count as raw ground sesame seeds because it's roasted. You could go to the health food store and pick these up already raw and ground in the refrigerated section or the freezer section. And you could easily make this part of your routine. You just need to consume this once a day. But again, the more of these seeds you consume, the more benefit you're going to experience. If you have PCOS, or if you don't receive your cycles regularly, and you're already past day 14, but you're already past day 28, you continue on assuming that you're in the luteal phase. Okay? Now, what if you're like really, really perimenopausal and you haven't had your cycle in like 6+ months? Have both mixtures of seeds. Because your cycle is getting less cyclical, you need the driving fats for both estrogen and progesterone, and you should just combine the two.
Neely, can I ask a question?
Please.
Would the same be said for if you are breastfeeding and your cycle hasn't returned, that you should eat a mixture?
100%. Such a little smarty pants. I'm so proud of you. 100%. If you are not anticipating to have a cycle, your hormones are not cyclical, then again, you should have both of these seeds in equivalent amounts. So you put all of them in a jar, you mix it together, and you have a few tablespoons of that every day. And then the more seeds you have, the more supportive it's going to be. But 2 tablespoons is really all you need in each phase. Fantastic question. So this is solution number 1. And I'm going to repeat that this is a really, really actionable thing to do. It's really, really easy to implement as long as you don't mind seeds. And the results that you get from this one thing will change your hormonal experience. It's magic. And you might think that it's silly that I just keep talking about how magical it is, but I've seen just this one intervention help women with PMDD. And if it could help something as cruel and horrible as that condition, then it could help you with any of your hormonal imbalances. Okay. The second one is stress management. Speaking from someone who's chronically stressed, this is probably the second most important thing that you can do, if not the first thing that you could do.
Neely,
Yeah,
Neely, I have a question on the seeds. If I'm okay for pregnancy, I should also mix them.
yes, 100%.
Okay.
Anytime you're in a position where your hormones are not cyclical, postpartum,
Pregnant.
pregnancy, perimenopause, menopause, I mean perimenopause like really at the end, and menopause, when your hormones are no longer cyclical, then you combine all of the seeds together.
And that just kind of keeps the hormones balanced when you
It
combine
gives
them.
you the necessary precursors to make the hormones so that the hormones are not, one of the reasons why we are deficient is in our hormones is because sometimes we just don't have the precursors or the necessary minerals to build them. And by seed cycling and eating seeds at different times, you're supporting the production of either estrogen because you have more of the backbone for it, or progesterone because you have more of the backbone for it.
Okay.
Okay,
Neely,
so
how do
number
you eat it? How do you eat that practically? How do you put that
so this
in
is how
your
I do
body?
it. So you could do it in a variety of different ways. You could either, obviously you grind them up because they need to be small bits so that you could digest them. So you could either add it on top of a salad. That's really some nice texture, in my opinion. I like the texture. You could add it to a smoothie. You can add it to oatmeal if the oatmeal is not too hot. You could add it to cooked foods as long as the food is not too hot that it destroys the fat. So it could be added to oatmeal, it could be added to your salads, it could be added to smoothies. If you were eating dairy and dairy doesn't cause an issue for you, you could put it in your yogurt. Those are different ways that you could consume it. You could even make like raw little bars with dates and put the seeds in them if you wanted to. It's a creative way. Those are all different ways that you could incorporate seed cycling. Okay. Then the second most important intervention, if not the most important intervention, is stress management. Because stress, as we've seen, affects every part of the hormone producing process. It affects the hypothalamus. It affects the pituitary gland. It affects the adrenals. It affects the thyroid. It affects the ovaries. Stress affects every single part of the process. And it is wise, and I'm speaking to myself at the same time that I'm speaking to everyone else, it is wise to implement stress management activities that are either daily or weekly. So I'm giving you some suggestions. Talk therapy or any form of therapy will help you manage the stress that is out of your control, that is real, and the stress that is made up in your mind that's imaginary. Having someone to talk to, someone who could guide you, someone who could give you resources and tools is really, really helpful. And I think really should be the first thing that a person should do if you have a hormonal imbalance. That's not to say that if you just go to a therapist, now your hormonal imbalance is resolved. No, 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 no. Once you have an imbalance, that's going to require some type of physical intervention. But what we're saying is, let's stop perpetuating the problem. We need to incorporate some type of stress management so that we could stop perpetuating the stress influence on your hormones. If stress has already caused an imbalance, it still needs to be rectified some other way, but we need to stop perpetuating the problem. Now, stress doesn't affect everyone's hormones the same way. Stress could affect other people in different ways. Some people, it affects their hormones. So again, talk therapy is a really great way to manage stress. Regular exercise that's manageable is a really great way to handle stress. Breath work is an excellent way to handle stress and is really fantastic for the pulsatility of the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. There's a really fantastic application that I highly recommend for everyone to use. It's called Open Breathwork. I don't think you can see my icon. I'll share it in a link with the email when I send out the recording. It's an excellent application, really easy to follow. Just doing 5 minutes of regular breathwork every day is amazing for your hypothalamus and pituitary connection. Then there are things like cranial sacral and massage that can help eliminate the physical trapped stress that we experience. If you know someone who is available to do that, try to do at least monthly, if not more than that, if you can afford it. And if you don't know someone who does it, ask your friends. Most likely someone in your orbit knows someone. And last but not least, there are a lot of different herbs that you can take that help manage stress. So my favorite ones, there are tons out there, but my personal favorites are ashwagandha, which helps condition the adrenal glands, rhodiola, which also helps condition the adrenal glands, saffron, which helps with the pituitary, albizia, which helps with the parasympathetic nervous system, schizandra, which helps with the adrenal glands, lemon balm, also the adrenal glands, and my favorite is relora, which comes from magnolia, which literally decreases cortisol. So remember we talked about that cortisol, how it steals progesterone, relora, fantastic for that. Okay. The next solution that again will help any person with any type of hormonal imbalance, magnesium glycinate, helps with stress and anxiety, helps with thyroid dysfunction, helps with the production of GnRH, helps with the production of estrogen, helps with the production of progesterone, decreases ovarian inflammation, helps with perimenopause. I mean, everything that we talked about today, magnesium glycinate helps. The issue with it is most people take the wrong form of magnesium for their hormones. It has to be glycinate. You want to take anywhere from 150 milligrams to 300 milligrams, 2 to 4 times a day. It's better taken in small doses throughout the day, not all together. And you want to make sure that you don't take so much that it could cause diarrhea, okay? Whether it's 2 times a day or 4 times a day, people are really going to differ. And when you should stop taking it, if you notice that you have muscle cramps, but most likely it's not going to do that because this form of magnesium glycinate really doesn't do that. Okay, The next herb or suggestion that I have for anyone who's watching this that has a hormonal imbalance, that's not really quite sure what to do, but wants to better themselves, chasteberry. Chasteberry, otherwise known as Vitex, is a really powerful herb that gently stimulates the pituitary gland to respond to the ovaries. It's great for perimenopause, it's great for low progesterone, it's great for low estrogen, it's great for estrogen dominance. It helps most women with most of their hormonal conditions. And you could take anywhere from 500 to 1,000 milligrams twice daily with hardly any negative side effects. Okay. The next one is fish oil. Fish oil helps with low progesterone, it helps with low estrogen, it helps with any type of ovarian inflammation, it helps with perimenopause. It also helps with a lot of the external issues that will then attack the ovaries and negatively affect the hormones. Now, I prefer fish oil as a form of omega-3 fatty acids. Most people have an omega-3 fatty acid deficiency. But if you don't want to take fish oil, you could take flaxseed oil. Just know then you have to take double the amount in order for you to get the same type of benefit. So either a fish oil or a flaxseed oil. When it comes to fish oil, just make sure that you refrigerate it so that it lasts longer and that it comes from small fish like sardines and anchovies and not big fish like tuna, something to pay attention to. The sixth thing that you should consider when you're balancing your hormones is reducing inflammation. So it's like this. Inflammation is caused by so many different things for so many different people. What causes inflammation for one person is not going to be the same thing that causes inflammation for another. But inflammation upsets the hypothalamus and pituitary. It upsets the thyroid and it upsets the ovaries. It's one of the biggest supporters of PCOS, of, again, worsening effects of perimenopause and menopause, of low progesterone, estrogen dominance, and low estrogen. Did I repeat that? Anyway, so reducing inflammation is really, really imperative. But again, like I said, there are different ways of tackling it, and that's one of the reasons why it's really good to go to someone one-on-one to get a really direct approach. So for some people, it's making sure that you're avoiding gluten, dairy, and processed foods. What causes inflammation is not the same thing as an allergy. And so you could take a gluten intolerance, you could take a gluten allergy test, you could see if you're celiac, you could see if you have an allergy and have it show up negative in both and still have it cause inflammation. Inflammation is really, really hard to test for. What are the contributing factors for it? So we're kind of going in the dark and saying, these are the different things that you should try to see what combats your inflammation. It takes about 3 weeks to see a drop in your inflammatory process. So again, I'm just giving you the most common reasons for inflammation. One could be avoiding gluten, dairy, and processed foods. The other one is to follow an antihistamine diet. Some people have a histamine intolerance. That's what causes their inflammation. And if you're curious about what that is, go online. I'm skipping this for a second. Digestive repair. Sometimes people have some type of digestive dysfunction, whether it's poor enzyme activity, whether it's SIBO, whether it's leaky gut, whatever it could be, and that could be the driving force of their inflammation that's then causing a hormonal imbalance. The next one could be insulin sensitivity. Any type of insulin resistance could be causing inflammatory response. And then besides doing these 4 things in regards to seeing what is actually activating it, there are some other things that you can incorporate, like cold therapy, like cold plunging is really, really fantastic, specifically in the luteal phase, if I'm not mistaken, and herbs. So omega-3, turmeric, baswila, fenugreek, black seed oil, and nettle are the herbs that I specifically like for women who have an inflammatory condition and it's affecting their hormones, because there's a lot of different things that you could take for for inflammation. But for hormones, that's what I like. And then the very last solution that applies to everyone is sleep. Now, sometimes when you have drops in progesterone, drops in estrogen, or even estrogen dominance, your sleep gets affected and it won't resolve itself until those hormones get resolved. So this is very much like what comes first, the chicken or the egg. When your hormones drop, they could disrupt your sleep and you have to rectify your hormones in a different way. But what is important to understand is having the chronically poor sleep will drive your hypothalamus crazy, will drive your pituitary gland crazy. And the things that you do to compensate for that lack of sleep will also drive the hypothalamus crazy and the pituitary gland crazy. And that's why it's so important to make sure that you're getting adequate sleep. And this is going to be really, really important in your 30s and 40s because this is going to be what protects the ovaries, helps your body fight inflammation that again makes perimenopause worse, and protect you. So we really want to make sure that we strive for 7 to 9 hours of sleep, 8 being the goal. 6 does not cut it. 6 does not cut it for any woman in her 30s and 40s. Maybe if she was younger, she could pull it off and it would not affect her hormones. But sleep in your 30s and 40s needs to be 7 to 9 hours. Those are all the basic suggestions that every woman should follow in order not to have a hormonal problem. And if she does, regardless of her hormonal problem, would benefit her. And then individually, I wrote out what is something that I could recommend to the hormonal problems that we talked about that would not cause any harm and would receive benefit. So when it comes to low progesterone, these are the things that I would suggest. When it comes to estrogen dominance, these are what I would suggest. When it comes to low estrogen, this is what I would specifically suggest. When it comes to adrenal fatigue, this is what I would suggest. Insulin resistance, etc. On your own time, because anyone who's participated and signed up, I'm going to give you these slides and you'll be able to look back and really help benefit yourself and be your own advocate. I understand that we went over time. I would love to open the floor for questions, but until I do, I would like to take the moment to just tell you about something that is new for me that I'm launching in January, which is the Nourished Women's Circle. What I see as a major problem with women's health is women are not given correct guidance with their own unique hormonal conditions. Their testing is not done on the right days. Their tests are not being interpreted and explained to them. They're not being given precise and specific solutions to fix their hormonal imbalances. And not only that, we all know that it's really, really challenging to follow through with a plan long term, long enough to transition past that, oh, I just received really good results, to, oh, this is my way of life. And so I came to fix that. I wanted to create a new system for women that will be helpful, specific, and supportive. And so this is the Nourished Women's Circle. It's starting January 5th. It's designed to assess every woman's blood work and give her a unique physical assessment so that we could figure out what her own hormonal issue is. Excuse me, guys. Now, I'm recovering from laryngitis and it's coming up now. So the program is designed to give people their personal assessments by looking at their blood work and physically assessing them. And then what we do is we give every single participant a customized plan. She's then part of a group that is no more than 30 women so that it's really nice and intimate. We curate who is in the group so that it's a really great and supportive dynamic. And then we give every woman weekly meal plans that are specific to her, specific to her plan. And we support her and we give her classes and courses so that she could learn how to better nurture herself. This is something that you could find more information on nourishdaily.com, which is my new child, my new baby. And the next group that's starting is January 5th. So if you would like to learn more about this, I'm so happy to answer your individual questions on this. You could reach out to me privately and I could tell you if this would be a good fit for you. And with that, I open the floor to anyone who has any questions or would like to learn more. Does anyone have any questions about what we've discussed about today? About your
Yeah,
specific
I have a
situation?
question.
Yes.
Do you recommend a particular brand for this for the supplements that you were recommending?
Brands are
And my
really,
second
really
question,
important.
ah,
Brands are really, really important. I could recommend brands for like the magnesium, the glycinate, and the fish oil, and I could even add those brands to the email when I send out the recording. I'd be happy to do that. But if we were to take a look at the lecture, just a second, going back to that. If I go like for here, for example, because there are so many supplement suggestions, either in the hypothyroid and low estrogen, I won't be able to give specific suggestions for that for everyone because that would take me too long. But if you find that you're in one of those categories and would like a specific recommendation, I'm more than happy to do that for you. So I'll give you guys specific suggestions for what I mentioned here, okay? And then if you have something specific to you, I'd be so happy to answer you personally and give you a suggestion.
okay, thank you. My other question is, the course that you're gonna open in January is very specific about fertility, or is about like overall
Actually,
nutrition
fertility
for
is
women?
not the
Like,
reason why someone would join. Fertility is its own unique issue, and people who are searching for fertility should really receive custom one-on-one support rather than group support because it is so unique. Besides, obviously, support groups for anyone who's struggling. But this specific group is helping 5 different kinds of women. It's helping women who have PCOS. It's helping women between the ages of 18 to 40 who have undiagnosed hormonal imbalances, meaning they know that something is going on with them, but nobody's helped them pinpoint what's going on. Like the other day, I got a phone call from someone and she was in tears because most likely she has something called PMDD, and no one has properly tested her to be able to confirm if this is what's happening. So if you're a woman who's not getting answers and is really struggling with her hormones or wants to prevent the struggling of hormones, then this group is for you. It's also for women who understand that they're experiencing perimenopause or really want to make sure that their perimenopausal symptoms are minimized as much as possible. Women who are in menopause already and women who are postpartum and really struggling to get their hormones in check. So it's essentially for any hormonal imbalance that's not fertility, that's not endometriosis, and that's not a gene mutation, like a chromosomal abnormality.
I
Does
have a
any,
question.
please?
Okay, two questions. One question is like, what would you consider like if a girl, a teenager is healthy, when is like a healthy time to start her cycle?
I think it really depends on her weight. If she's really petite and underweight, I think that it's fine for her to start her cycle even at the age of 16, which is,
Okay.
excuse me, which is much later than the average. But as we saw, like your fat tissue is what really will stimulate your hypothalamus to kick into gear and then stimulate your ovaries to be like, okay, ovulation's now gonna happen. So if you're a young woman and you're, you know, really petite and really thin, then it really makes sense that you're going to start late. If you are not really petite and thin, you're 12, you're 14, you're 16, you're of average size and build, and you haven't gotten your period, then it's something to look into. It's something to look into your pituitary gland, which I've seen multiple times go underlooked. So that's why a prolactin test is so important. It's really important to see if PCOS wasn't being developed under the surface and then therefore a period just never occurred. That's something that sometimes happens. So it really depends on the size and the height and the build of the girl that we're talking about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's very clear. So like if it's actually I'm like thinking about my niece and her mother is extremely, extremely concerned. And she's 14 and she hasn't gotten a cycle and she's like trying to convince her daughter to like eat fatty foods. And I'm like, I'm wondering if and the daughter is like obsessed with health. Like she loves eating healthy and I think she's fine. Like, but would you tell someone to encourage their daughter to like
She's
eat more fatty
14.
food? Yeah.
I mean, I think this is so hard to answer. I really, really
Right.
think individually this is really hard to answer because orthorexia, which I'm not saying that she has, but is something that really, really comes up with young girls. And if a girl is not eating enough healthy fats, then like we said with seed cycling, then she's not really giving her body the ingredients that it needs in order to build up her estrogen and her progesterone, and that could definitely be what's stopping her cycle from happening. But who knows if that's the case? Um, so
Meaning
I
like
think
she could encourage her to eat more healthy fats, but she doesn't have to like kind of push her to eat meat with the fat on the meat. Like,
no, I would say encouraging the healthy consumption of seeds, like seed cycling, is really as much as you need to do, as long as she's not underweight. If she is underweight and she's purposely underweight, then that's a whole separate story. But if she's not purposely underweight, then no food needs to be forced on her unless healthy seeds, which have the backbones of the fats that are necessary.
okay, thank you. And the second question, which is also family related, is um you mentioned in the class like someone who is in menopause could be struggling. I think people in menopause could struggle with like emotional health because there's less estrogen,
100%.
right?
Yeah, so a lot of times okay, so this is really important when it comes to menopause and perimenopause, which again can happen 10 years before. So estrogen and progesterone in their own ways start to decline. Progesterone typically first. That will affect sex drive. It'll affect how you perceive your partner. It will affect how you perceive the life around you. It'll affect how connected you feel. It'll affect your serotonin production, all of that. And so sometimes the intervention that doctors will use is an SSRI. And what happens to a lot of women is maybe some of the symptoms will improve, but not all of the symptoms. And if they instead took estrogen or some type of bioidentical medication, which is actually really fantastic to do, it's actually really fantastic to take um, uh, bioidentical hormones if you're a candidate for them, then that could actually resolve your depression, resolve your sex drive, resolve your sleep that comes when perimenopause and menopause strike, and can also be a really nice prevention for the aging that happens with the decline of estrogen. So depending on a lot of different factors, if you take estrogen or progesterone as you phase out of your cycle, then that could prevent dementia, it could prevent heart disease, it could help, of course, prevent depression. So the important point is to right now learn how to test. And then if you find that you're doing all the natural things to drive up your estrogen or your progesterone and it's just not working, and you are a candidate for bioidenticals in some form or fashion, whether it's a cream that you use cyclically or it's something that's prescribed by your doctor, that is a really, really great option. And of course, in the group that I was talking about, if someone is in that case, we would direct them to what would be their best option. So like we would tell them, for example, this cream would be really helpful. This is how you use it. These are the days that you do it. And then if that's not sufficient and they need something actual ingested, then we would direct them to how to do that as well.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Millie.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
is there any correlation between having your period very early in age with an early menopause?
That's such a fantastic question. I'm not sure, like, how early are we talking? Like 10?
So I had my period at 9,
Mm-hmm.
and I was very average built, and I was 9 years old. And back then, my parents took me to the doctor and my pediatrician, and she said that everything was fine and it was just normal. But now I don't know. Like I go to my gynecologist now and regularly for checkups, and she's always saying that everything is fine, that everything is fine, and and but I still feel a bit curious that because I had my period so young, I might, you know, be a
I'm so
bit,
sorry,
or
but
it's
how
just,
old are you?
I'm 33.
You're 33. And are you interested in having, like, are you interested in getting pregnant and having more pregnancies if you've already had or haven't had? Is that why
Yes.
you're asking? Is it because of a
Not now.
pregnancy-related issue, or is it
Yeah.
because of you're
Yep.
concerned about menopause?
I mean, no, but pregnancy, but it's also menopause, because if I get menopause, then I won't get pregnant. It's
Right, I hear
related,
you.
but
So I don't think that you
yeah.
have something to be concerned about in regards to menopause, because in regards to menopause, so many different factors affect it. The-
What you said in the workshop, that the pre-menopause that can start
Right.
10 years
So
before.
so that also has a lot of different factors. And I think that when you started your cycle, probably has an influence in the sense that you had a few more years to lose eggs and ovulate. But was your cycle even consistent in the first few years of when you had it?
Yeah, since then it's been
It
always
was?
very consistent.
Oh, that's really great. Okay, so you've had some more follicle loss, but it's very, very individual in the sense of like when it's going to happen. Like I'll give you an example. Like women who have a lot of pregnancies or women who have been taking birth control have more egg reserve because women who've had a lot of pregnancies have basically stopped a lot of follicles from being um, matured. And women who've been taking birth control and stopped ovulation have also stopped a lot of follicles from being matured. So there is an association that the more ovulations you stop, either by pregnancy or by birth control, perhaps that does delay menopause. However, women who've had multiple pregnancies vary greatly in when their menopause starts. Women who've taken birth control vary greatly on when their menopause starts. So it could be that the more you stop your own ovulations, maybe that pushes off your own potential age of menopause. But when that actually is going to start happening is really dependent on other things. And the most you could do to prevent it is by decreasing inflammation as much as possible and monitoring your progesterone. Because if you support your progesterone, you're helping the feedback loop continue on. And then that in and of itself will help keep the HPO axis going like it's supposed to. If you're really, really nervous about when you're going to go into menopause, doing an FSH test the FSH test on day 2 or 3 of your cycle will be the best indicator of how close you are to menopause. The higher your FSH, the closer you are to menopause. Now, your FSH does fluctuate. So the best time to test your FSH is on day 2 or 3. Like if that's what you're concerned about, then day 2 or 3 is the best day to test it. As long as your FSH is really nice and low, then you know that menopause and perimenopause is not your issue. The moment FSH starts to climb, then you know you're heading towards there. And then again, there are a lot of interventions that you could do to try to push it off as much as possible. Decrease inflammation, watch your progesterone, which again, we test on day 21, and all the, again, the different things that affect the HPO axis, managing stress, treating your thyroid, etc.
And to test your progesterone, you need to do blood work. Like you can ask your family doctor to do that for you.
Right. So remember, on day 2 or 3, it doesn't give us so much information, but that is the day to test your FSH. So if it is something that you're concerned about, just get it tested for. And another thing that you might want to get tested for is AMH, which will test the quality of your eggs. It will test the
I
quality
already
of your
did that
egg reserve.
one,
Oh, perfect.
and like my doctor sent it to me to do privately. And she just told me, like, I didn't understand the numbers or anything. She just told me, oh, it's normal.
Normal is always
it's normal.
great. You're always more than welcome to send it to me, and I'd be happy to give you my opinion.
Oh, thank you. Because she also told me, like, I don't qualify for like coverage because they're not low to freeze my eggs.
You're in
Because in
America?
no, I'm in Israel. Is this from
You're in
Israel?
Israel?
Or
That's really interesting. I'm surprised by that.
oh, I thought that
Reach
you're
out to
not
me
in Israel
privately
right now.
afterwards.
Are you in Israel right now, or you're in the
I
States?
am. That's why it's black outside.
I have a question.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Okay,
but May, I want you to reach out to me privately and we'll make sure to address this, okay?
thank you so much.
Of course. Christina, I'd be happy to answer your question.
I just got to run out of here. But if we start supplementing with these recommendations, how long does it normally take for it to
Oh, such a
subside?
great question. 4 weeks to see changes. Anytime you do any type of intervention for your hormones, whether it's diet, whether it's herbal, whether it's stress management, whatever it is, takes 4 weeks because that is the typical length of your cycle. Now, when you start implementing this intervention, it could do a few things. It could like tune up your hormones so that they go on track very quickly. It could happen. Or it could cause you to skip a beat. It could cause your period to come too early, or it could cause your period to come too late. Sometimes it's like the first pancake when you're making pancakes, like the very first one is like really weird, and then the rest of them are great. So that's sometimes what happens with hormonal intervention is that the first cycle after an intervention can be very strange. And that's sometimes a really good sign because it means like something is stimulating something. So typically you see changes in 4-week patterns. So the first 4 week marks the first amount of progress. The second 4 weeks does the next amount of progress. And depending on the situation at hand, it could take months to resolve or weeks to resolve. PCOS, for example, can take months to resolve. But if it's diagnosed correctly, meaning you understand what the root cause of the hormonal imbalance is, it takes a lot less time to resolve.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure. I don't know who CB is, but it looks like you raised your hand.
Yeah, it's Christina. It's funny because I thought you meant me
Christina.
on the last caller. Yeah, I have a question. So I'm really in the later end of sort of the groups that you talked about, like testing for maybe reduced progesterone with perimenopause. I'm in my early 40s and I have fibroids, I just found out, and one cyst. I'm going to go see a OBGYN that specializes in oncology for some reason. That's the referral I got. So I'm just
Mhm.
wondering, what test exactly should I maybe ask for, since I sort of am already having some sort of symptoms showing up?
So again, we can't draw a conclusion with one data set.
Yeah.
So I would test for day 21 and I would test on day 10. And I would look at the blood test that I suggested, do all of the blood tests at least once.
Okay.
And on the second day, the second scheduled day that you have, just do the hormones. And that will give you an assessment of where you are hormonally. Are you producing enough estrogen to ovulate? And then what's your progesterone like? If you're producing enough estrogen, are you in the estrogen dominant state, which is typically the second step in perimenopause? Or is your estrogen fine and it's just simply progesterone is not high enough? And then there's a lot of different things that can be decided from that. Is it from your thyroid? Is it from stress? Is it perhaps the ovary itself is not strong enough and it's not producing, the corpus luteum is not producing enough progesterone? There's a lot that could be ticked off by just looking at the blood work as a whole.
Okay.
And depending on what that is, what the answer is to that, then you'll implement the correct solution. So it could be that you use progesterone cream, let's say in your luteal phase, not the whole cycle, but just the luteal phase. Or in the first half of the phase, depending again on where your estrogen is at. So first, we always problem solve. We do the test, we figure out what our situation is. Once we understand the situation, then we could implement the correct intervention. So as far as, like I said, do the test, the whole test on one of the days, and on the second data set day, either on day 10 or day 21, you're going to do the second set of hormone tests.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Are there
I'm leaving now. I'm gonna send you an email, and I'm very interested in
amazing day?
joining in January. So hopefully we can meet each other again. Thank you so much.
Yay! It'll be really fun. It'll be really great. Okay, amazing,
Thank-
May. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to say that I really appreciate your patience. I know that this was a very long lecture. I tried to make these lectures short. I really thought that I would be able to cover all of this in an hour, but I just feel like I don't know who's going to join the Women's Circle and join all the courses that are going to be available, which are bite-sized pieces. So I just kind of am one of those guys that are overly on top of you. I'm just here's all the information, please ingest it. So anyways, I hope that you've taken something from this, that it was helpful in some capacity, that you know at least how to read your own blood work, how to ask for the blood work, what you should do in order for your hormones to be as in alignment as possible. And if you guys have any questions, message me. You will receive an email from me and with the recording and the presentation. And feel free to share it with your friends, because the more people who know about it, know about how to take care of themselves, the better we all are as women. So wonderful. All right, you guys, have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.